Do you offer a specialized study plan with tutoring? Yeah, so if you go to reasonprep.com/ is it tutoring? I forget my own links. Let me see. I believe it's reasonprep.com/tutoring. Let me just check. Yeah. reasonprep.com/tutoring. You can learn more about my tutoring service. The answer is yes, I do. And essentially how it works when we do the full tutoring is each week I set you up with a set of homework assignments to complete for that week. And that includes things like practice sections, videos for my courses to watch. All my tutoring students get access to all my videos for free. Yeah, sorry, my mind is half gone today. It's a very busy week. It's the week before the ACT, so I'm tutoring like all day. So my mind is kind of broken right now. But anyway, I'll try my best to be coherent. So you get a study plan for each week, what to do for homework assignments. So practice sections, practice texts, worksheets, packets, flashcard review, videos to watch, other practice questions or other resources to consult. You'll get a listing of what to do for that week, so you know between our sessions what you should work on. And each week I design that for you individually, depending on your goals, your needs, where you're at. So yeah, that is definitely part of it. We don't just do practice tests. So I do a practice test probably about every 3 weeks, maybe even every 4 weeks, because full practice tests are not really how you learn. Full practice tests tell you where you're at in your scoring range, but they don't tell you, they don't really help you learn as much. We learn more through practice sections, timed sections, worksheets, packets, videos, targeted instruction like that. Okay, highest math score is a 780. Awesome, very good, congrats. I've been doing some pretty hardcore any tips to get my score to an 800? I've been doing some pretty hardcore content review for the last couple of weeks. So you're doing exactly what you have to do. You're at the point where the difference between a 780 and 800 is 2 questions. And so luck, silly mistakes, not knowing a certain piece of content or forgetting it that day, too much variance comes in. You're always going to be bouncing around within a certain tight range. The goal is to get that range a little bit higher. So what you're doing sounds exactly right. Focus especially in your situation on the hard questions. So in section 3, it's 12 to 15 and 18 to 20. Section 4, 24 to 30, 35 to 38. So those are the ones you want to drill. Make sure you know those really well and all the concepts that go along with it. In addition to that, it's going to be avoiding silly mistakes. And I have a lot of videos in previous live streams I've talked about how to avoid silly mistakes. In fact, if you go to my channel, you look up my recent videos, I made a video, an excerpt video about how to avoid silly mistakes. But it sounds like you're doing exactly what you want to do. You want to keep just hitting the concepts, because you're kind of, think of, here's a good analogy. This actually makes a lot of sense, I think. Imagine you have your time axis here and your score axis here for SAT math, and let's say this is the score of an 800. You can kind of think your score improvement, we can generally just imagine to model it kind of like a log, or not a log function, but like a function that approaches the 800 score asymptotically, such that your first initial improvements are going to be pretty quick, right? You can see that the slope of this is pretty steep over this time period. But as you get closer and closer and closer to 800, you're going to get less improvement on average for the time you invest, because you're dealing with smaller and smaller ranges. So that's the way to think about it. You're in this region, so it's really just pushing, doing exactly what you're doing. It sounds like you're doing what you want to do. There aren't any specific question types that you miss. Yeah, that makes it a little bit harder, because it's more random. It's like one day you miss the trig question, another day you miss a function question, another day you miss a percent question. That makes it harder if there's no obvious weaknesses. Again, that's why it's just continuing to push on those hard things and not ignoring what you're already good at. So make sure you can get better and faster at the stuff you already get right, to leave you more time and energy to deal with the harder stuff. We'd have to see some specific questions that you're getting wrong and try to figure out why you're getting them wrong to give more specific advice, but at least that's where I would start, trying to think about it at least. In what way can I benefit from the previous record I made in the log Google Sheets of the questions that I did wrong in the previous official test? So I believe this is referring to, in my study plan course, there's like a Google Sheet that comes with it that you can use to keep track of your progress and the questions you got wrong. And this question is basically asking, what do I do with the previous questions that I've gotten wrong in the months or weeks before? This is a really great question because this is an overlooked part of studying that I think the more I think about it is more and more important. And so what you want to do is redo these questions. Redo these questions, the ones you got wrong. If you redo these questions and you still get them wrong, then you know you don't know the material yet. If you do them again and you get them right, well, that's at least moving in the direction that you know exactly how to tackle those questions. So redo them. You don't have to do them timed. One of the things I'm thinking about developing down the line, and I'm curious what people would eventually think about it, is like putting these cards on flashcards, or instead of putting them on paper, putting them in a kind of a card format so that you could kind of set aside the questions you've gotten wrong and in the future redo them in a kind of organized way. I think that would be really useful. It's something I'm thinking about doing. It's just a complicated project potentially. So, but definitely redo them. Don't ignore them. And then if you get them wrong again, set them aside again. Do them again later. Again, you don't have to do them timed, but certainly redoing those questions can absolutely be very useful to confirm or not whether you know the material. The ACT Science is so hard, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. Yeah, it is hard. The timing is really rough. The passages seem pretty intimidating very often. It's super different from a lot of what you've done in your classes, or even in your science classes. So yeah, it definitely seems hard. But I think the focus there should be on that it seems hard. I think the test is more intimidating than it actually is when you see how the questions are solved, how you approach them. So I would say your feeling is totally valid, but what you eventually want to see is actually it's not maybe as bad as it may seem on the surface, that it's a lot of bark, not much bite. Now, certainly there are parts of it that are hard. I'm not saying it's not, but I think it seems harder than it is. In terms of what you're supposed to do, it's very broad. I can't go through everything to do for ACT Science. That would be, 5 live streams. But where I would say is go to my YouTube channel. Go to my YouTube channel. Just Google Reason Prep. And I have a playlist, ACT Science playlist. So I have some videos there from various topics related to ACT Science. I've got some preview videos for my ACT Science Bootcamp, which is my complete course on my site. But I've got a lot of other videos in the ACT Science playlist, which covers various topics. I would start there. And make sure you use those and do a lot of practice sections. Do them timed. Always do them timed. Beyond that, if you have any more specific questions, I'd be happy to address that further. I need more help on the ACT Science section as well. I seem to drain a lot of time and can't interpret the graphs correctly. How do we approach these questions? So if you want to send or pick a specific question that we can look at from a real ACT, I'd be happy to do that. I can give more specific, focused advice. Generally, in terms of graph questions, the main thing I would say is you should know the type of question that you're dealing with. And you have questions just like fact find, where basically you just have to find the piece of data in the table or the graph. It's pretty straightforward. You've got questions involving what's called extrapolation and interpolation, where you're basically extending the trend of a curve, or you're looking within a curve to see what points would correspond to that curve itself, whether you've extended it or you're looking at points within it. You've got questions based on comparing, let me just say like cross-referencing figures, where you have to take data from one and use it to help you answer a question based on another figure. So it's kind of knowing what's in the universe, but also kind of knowing that, as I was saying before with the ACT Science section, these questions are actually often some of the easier ones. So a lot of times what students run into with these is way overthinking it and way concerning themselves too much with the science and like what it means, rather than kind of being used to, okay, what are the kinds of things they ask me, such as these, and what's the easiest, most simple way to answer them. So if you want to give a specific example from a test, you can just name the test date and question, and I'll find it, and we can take a look at a specific question. I'd be happy to do that. Should I study vocab in the short term for SAT reading? So a lot of caveats here. Generally, I'd say no, it's probably not a good use of your time, depending on your score, depending on what exactly you mean by short term. For most students, the answer would be no, though, just because there's probably other leaks in your approach or strategy that are making more of a difference. If you have the time and the inclination then studying vocabulary might be useful. I have a vocabulary list on my website. Just go to reasonprep.com, look for a vocab list. But for most students, the answer to this would probably be no. Because there's just too many other things you could focus on that are more profitable than studying a list of words that frankly are somewhat speculative. And yeah, so I would probably say no in most cases. Okay, so questions about his or her on the SAT. I don't think I've seen this too much on the ACT, but if it applied, it would technically still be applicable there. So let me give an example of this to see what this might look like. And there'll be another one of these cases where I'll give you guys a second to think about the question, and then I'll talk about it. So let me think of a sentence here. So the question is, here's a sentence. Each student should bring their books to class. Is this correct? Is there appropriate here? Or should we use his or her? So I will give you all a minute to think about that. Should this be there? Or should it be his or her? Those are our two choices. So should it be there or his or her? Which one do you think should go in this case? If you want, you can post your answer in chat. You don't have to. You can just silently think along. But I'll give you a few seconds to think about it, and then we'll talk about what the answer is and why. Okay, so this is going to be indeed his or her. Why? Well, the first thing to see, and this is one of the tricky parts, is this noun, each student, or the noun, student being the noun and each being the adjective, but basically the noun phrase, each student, is the antecedent. It's what this pronoun is referring to. And when you have each student, this is actually singular. Same would be true if it was every student. Every student, each student is actually singular, weirdly enough. You'd think it might be plural, but it's actually singular. So a plural pronoun there is actually inappropriate because this is an example of what's called pronoun agreement. Your pronouns have to agree with their nouns in number. So if the noun is singular, as it is in this case, you need a singular pronoun. Now, you could go with each student should bring his books to class, or each student should bring her books to class if you were referring to a single gendered group. It used to be in the 50s, for example, that we would just say his. His was the default pronoun in these cases. But we don't do that because that's sexist. We don't want to assume it's just men. So English doesn't have a really good solution for this. What we have to do then is use his or her, which is essentially the gender neutral singular pronoun. And so that would be appropriate here because it's singular, his or her, and it has both genders, so you don't have that issue of just his or just her. Now here's the thing, this is what it is on the SAT, his or her would be correct. In real life, we would probably never say his or her. This is where the trick comes in. We probably would say, or even read or write in real life, each student should bring their books to class, and no one would care, or at least people that we would want to be friends with wouldn't care, because it sounds fine. We understand what it's saying. There's no meaning lost. His or her is just really awkward. Each student should bring his or her books to class. It's just ugly. So we would use there in real life, but that's what they're doing. They want you to use your experience from kind of informal language in real life to go with something like there, but his or her is appropriate in this case. So to sum up, you use his or her when you need... To sum up, you use his or her when you need it to be singular, but you don't want to say just his or just her because it's a mix of people, even though it's singular. It's kind of a very weird edge niche case, but sometimes it comes up. If I know all the rules for the SAT writing section and watched all the course, what can I do other than solving practice tests to improve rhetorical skills? So these are the questions where you have to rearrange a sentence, delete a sentence, add a sentence. These really come down to reading skills. That's ultimately what it comes down to. So if your reading is something that's weaker for you, the reading section, that you might also find the rhetorical skills questions in the writing section are also pretty tricky because it takes the same kinds of skills. It's reading comprehension. It's determining, okay, what's the main idea of this passage or paragraph? How does the argument develop in the paragraph? What sentences or opening words or changes to the sentences might be appropriate to enhance the logic of the argument? So it's really reading. So a lot of what you would do for reading will also help you with these questions. Beyond learning the 4 principles which are in the course, doing practice questions, and really trying to understand the answers to the ones, especially the ones you get wrong. Besides that, and just doing what you would do for reading, there's not much more specific because it really comes down to reading and understanding the passage as a whole. I would say one tip for these in general, and I talk about this in the course and elsewhere, is don't get tunnel vision. By tunnel vision, I mean way too often students just focus on the underlined thing and kind of ignore the sentence or even the paragraph. They just kind of focus way too much on the underlined thing. You got to always keep your mind open to the sentence that's the underlined portion is in, at the very least, and very often the paragraph or even the sentence is just around that sentence. The more you get tunnel vision on these rhetorical skills questions, the more you'll lose track of. It basically becomes impossible to know what's appropriate as a choice. Same thing would be, again, this comes back to the strategies I talk about, the principles. Reread the question. Too often we focus so much on the passage and the choices and the underlined portion that we forget that there's often a question that needs to be answered directly. So those are 2 things I would say. Beyond that, yeah, it's really just like reading. So a lot of the challenges with reading come up here as well. How to know what is wrong if I study for a long time, but there's only little improvement in terms of the questions I get right, so should I change my way of studying? So it's hard to know without knowing exactly what you're doing with studying. For most people, though, I mean, here's the thing. If your way of studying is just doing a practice test and then checking your answers and then not really reviewing it and then doing another practice test and checking your answers and looking at your score and then doing another practice test and then doing another practice test and another practice test. If you're doing that, then yeah, you got to change your way of studying because that's not really efficient. If you're doing the studying in the way that I've laid out or others have laid out in terms of using your time effectively, watching videos, doing reading, whatever it is you're doing to practice, then in most cases, the issue is not with your study program. It's not like, oh, if only you had studied this way, you'd get an improvement. So I wouldn't worry about that. Sometimes these things just take time, especially, again, it depends on the section you're talking about. Reading, for example, can take time because it is very skill-based. So sometimes all you can really do is just keep at it. And then finally, if you're studying on your own, it really is important to get an outside perspective because if you're only studying on your own, self-prepping, you may not even know the mistakes you're making. You may be completely blind to your errors, even if you think you know them. Or you might be missing places for efficiency. So whether that's a tutor or joining a class, or really, in most cases, if that's not an option for you, working with a friend, study buddy, joining my study group on Facebook, working with a teacher at school or something, an older sibling or a parent, whatever it might be, you need that outside perspective. It doesn't have to be an SAT tutor if you've got other resources. But getting that outside perspective to say, hey, look, you're missing this mistake, you're totally missing this, or you're making this error and you don't realize it. That's really important too, because sometimes self-prep can only go so far. We're often blind to our own issues. So getting that outside perspective is probably the most important thing you should do at this point. How to finish the ACT science test. I took a practice test and skipped the whole passage and got a 24. Should I skip the guess on the ones I don't know, instantly move on so I can attempt all the passages? So I talk about this a lot in a lot of videos, my ACT science course. Don't get hung up on finishing the test. If you're getting a 24, it's not because you can't finish a test. Finishing a test is if you're going for, if your target right now is a 34 or a 35. Then finishing the test is important. But you can get a 30 without finishing the test, right? Nothing is stopping you from getting a 30 if you don't complete every question. What's stopping you is getting questions wrong, right? So finishing the test right now is not the goal. What the goal is getting more questions right. So getting to your question, you're moving in the right direction. Skipping the ones you don't know, or more appropriately, skipping the ones that seem hard and time-consuming and focusing on easier questions to bank those easy questions, to build a foundation, that's absolutely something you should do. I talk about this a lot in various videos and courses, but the key is to pick the easy questions, which are generally the graph and figure questions to start. You want to really make sure you get most, if not all, of those correct, because those are generally easier than the rest, and you need to bank those. The harder questions are going to be the ones on experimental design, reasoning, sometimes outside knowledge. I wouldn't really include that there. But basically, the experimental design, reasoning, conclusions type questions are the harder, generally more time-consuming questions. Now, not that you can't do them, but the priority, you need to bank these points. So in that passage you skipped, you perhaps, depending on the passage, skipped a lot of easy questions. It's possible, in favor of maybe working on harder questions elsewhere. So the actual approach and strategy is a bit more complicated, but generally, yeah, focus on easy questions. I recommend doing the passages in a certain order. So you generally want to do the 6-question passages first because they're typically easier than the rest. Then the 7-question research summary passages. These are the ones with experiment 1, experiment 2, experiment 3, things like that. And then the 7-question conflicting viewpoints passage absolutely last. That is the one that's basically all text that compares different scientists or students. That's the one you want to do last. And then within the passages, you want to focus on the easier questions first. Just as a side thing, I can say pretty unequivocally, I guess that's somewhat of a contradiction, so I can say unequivocally that if, we'll do this in red, if you are doing the questions in order from numbers 1 to 40, you are likely doing something wrong. So this might be interesting to some of you who don't know this. If you're doing the questions in the science section and also the reading section as well in the ACT, if you're doing them in order from 1 to 40, you're probably doing something wrong. Doing them in order from 1 to 40 is almost always inefficient and just not optimal. So doing the passages in this order and jumping around within the passages to focus on the easier questions is where you start. As a side note, this document that I'm writing on will be available after the session. You just got to go to my website. I'm going to put it up probably tomorrow. If you go to my website, go to the live stream section. I put up all the notes from the session so you can get access to everything I've written here there. How should you study off of Crack ACT? Just take as many practice ACT as possible. Well, yes and no. So I talk about this elsewhere, and I mentioned this earlier. Generally, I recommend taking a full timed practice test every 3 to 4 weeks, depending on how much time you have until the real thing. So this is where I differ from a lot of tutors, courses, companies, advice. I think the main, I was talking about before with that other student about the study schedule, and I don't think, the reason why I didn't bring this up there is I don't think that this is what that student was doing. This is where I have an exception though with what I was saying. If you are just doing practice test after practice test after practice test after practice test, especially if you're not reviewing your work after, reviewing every question, even the ones you got right, if you're not doing targeted review on certain topics or strategies or whatever, if you're just doing practice test after practice test, I guarantee you that's not good enough. You need to mix it up with a lot of other stuff. You only should be taking a full test every 3 to 4 weeks. So the question then comes, well, what should you do in the meantime? Well, that's exactly what I talk about in the study plan course. Practice tests, there's two uses for practice tests. I mean, you can use practice tests for sections, but I'm talking about like doing them all in a row, sitting down, doing the English, math, reading, science, or in the SAT, reading, writing, math, sitting it down and doing it all in a row. There's only 2 real uses for that. 1, get a score, know where you're at, more or less. And 2, build stamina. That's it. You don't improve by taking a practice test. That's not how you improve. Reviewing the practice test, yeah, that's certainly helpful, but just taking it doesn't help. It's like, imagine an athletic analogy. If you're a runner, if you do long distance, if you do sprinting, let's say you're a sprinter, do you get better by doing sprinting competitions? Not really. The sprinting competition is like a measure of where you're at. you get better from targeted, focused practice day after day. Sure, you do a lot of sprinting, but it's in a structured, ordered way. It's not just kind of like random, just sprinting. There's going to be a program put in place to help you build your strength, to get better, so that when competition day comes, in our analogy, the full test day comes, you're ready for that. So it's not just about practice tests. They're certainly important, but they're definitely not everything. Don't overdo practice tests. So do individual sections as practice? Yeah, that's one of the things you can definitely do. Do individual sections as part of the practice regimen. You always want to do them timed. Always do tests and sections timed. That's super important because, especially for the ACT, because time is such an important element. Always do them timed for sure. In the case of studying, self-studying, is there a limit where I can't improve anymore, or only a little improvement where I should start asking for others' help, or that I will improve by time? So totally depends on the situation. But I would say if you're noticing that you've hit a plateau, so you keep preparing, keep studying, you're doing the right things, but your score's not really budging, that's probably a sign that it might be useful to get some outside perspective, basically. Is there a limit to where you can improve? No, I think there are people who've gotten perfect scores by self-studying. Obviously, that's rare, but it's possible. There's no limit in principle to how high you can go with self-studying. But I think in reality, most people are going to hit a plateau where, if you're making a mistake, by definition, you don't know how to do something. How then are you supposed to know what you're supposed to do, like what mistake you're making if you can't do it, right? There's a disconnect there. And sometimes with enough work, you can overcome that, and enough guidance with books or videos or courses, whatever you're doing. But for many people, you need to have at least a little bit of input from somebody to point you maybe in the right direction with what you're doing. Okay, let's take a few more questions, and then we're going to wrap up for today. How to review ACT science practice tests. So this applies to really any practice section you do for the SAT or the ACT, but let's use the ACT science as an example. So first thing you do, get a real test, real tests only. So you should be able to avoid third-party tests like Barron's, Princeton Review. If you have real tests like you can get from Crack ACT, there's no reason to use any of that stuff, especially or in particular for timed sections. So get a real test, complete the test, timed. Use a bubble sheet if possible, because you want to simulate the test experience as much as possible, but definitely complete the test timed. Check your answers and score it. Then review every question, especially at first when you're first starting out. Eventually, when you're getting stronger and you understand a lot more of the questions, you can focus more on the ones you got wrong or the ones that gave you a little bit of trouble. But at first, you want to review every question. And if you got it right, did you get it right for a good reason? Right? So you can get a question right, but maybe you guessed. Maybe you got lucky. So you want to review that. If you got it right, can you do it better? So just because you got a question right doesn't mean there might not be a better way to complete the question next time. So you want to maybe get faster somehow. So you might ask that. If you got a question wrong, why? So did you not know a concept? Did you make an error? Did you misread something? Were you completely confused? Did you not know what the question said? You need to find this out. Find out what mistakes you made and record them. So have some sort of way to keep track of the mistakes you've made, a notebook, a Google Doc, a spreadsheet, whatever you use, whatever you like. But keep track of your mistakes. What are you doing? Try to find trends. And then rinse and repeat. Record your errors and come back to those questions later. So down the line, weeks or months later, you can come back to them and see after some studying if you get them right again. And that can also help to confirm whether you've gotten it. But yeah, that's the core of how you do a science test. It is a long process. You're going to spend, especially at first, more time reviewing the questions than you will doing the test. That's totally normal and totally okay and fine. So that's basically how the process works, and it helps to have a tutor guide you through that, but you can definitely self-study it. If I'm prepping for the September ACT, how should I go about watching these prep videos? I assume you mean mine. If you have access to all of the SAT and or all the ACT videos on my website, you can go to rprep.co/courses to learn more. How would you go about watching these? So basically how I set it up in the study plan, I would set a day a week to focus on each section. So like Monday might be English, Tuesday might be math, Wednesday might be reading, Thursday might be science, and then for the other 2 days that you would study, you could pick the 2 sections that give you the most trouble or rotate it in. So let's say you have the most trouble in math and science, so you might say Friday would be math, Saturday would be science, and Sunday would be like something like a rest. So on each of these days, you can watch 1 to 2. Depends on how much time you have. I guess you do a September ACT. So probably 30 to 45 minutes of video and complete a practice section. I go into more detail about this in the ACT, in the SAT ACT study plan course available free on my site. But yeah, this would be the general outline. So you'd break up each day for a different subject. You'd watch the videos on my site. You just watch them in order. There's nothing fancy about it. You just watch them as they're presented. I designed the videos to lay out exactly what you should do. And yeah, you just split it up like that. And then by the time you get to June, by the time you get to mid-July, you should probably be close to finish with, you'll definitely be finished with the lecture videos. And then you can start working through the solution videos to the practice tests. And yeah, you should be able to make it through all the videos by July, I would say, if you're working consistently. And you could adjust this. If you need to do more English, or you need to do more reading, or you don't really need to do reading as much, change it up. But that would be a good starting point.